Charles finally acknowledged what many had thought for decades at the age of 76. Even before he said such comments, he was already regarded as the royal family's garbage. His entire existence had been based on meticulously thought-out propaganda, denial, and deceit. To see why Charles disclosed everything at this age and how it all connected to his ex-wife, watch this video through to the conclusion. The burden of a crown he had not yet donned. Charles was born in November 1948 into a family that valued duty over self-interest. Elizabeth, his mother, was more than a mother from the start. The Queen was her. Charles was left in the care of nannies after the woman who put him to bed at night vanished for months while on Commonwealth tours. By sending him to Gordonstown, a notoriously cruel boarding school in Scotland, where he was tormented, ridiculed, and degraded, his father, Prince Philip, attempted to shape him into steel. Charles called it hell on earth in private correspondence. He never got over these scars. They instilled in him at a young age that feelings had no role in his life. However, those same repressed feelings would subsequently erupt in the most scandalous manner imaginable. The world witnessed Charles's development into a man, but they never saw the youngster in need of love. Every relationship he ever had would be governed by that lack of affection. Charles was already well known in affluent circles for his frequent dating when he was younger, before Diana and before Camilla. He had at least 20 committed relationships before he finally found a permanent home. Celebrities, nobles, and actresses were all meticulously used and then rejected since none of them was sufficient. Why? For the reason that Charles was never permitted to wed for love. The monarchy expected him to get married. The strain reached an intolerable level by the late 1970s. Lord Mountbatten, his uncle, encouraged him to look for a suitable spouse. Diana Spencer entered the realm of suitability, which was defined as youth, purity, and aristocratic connections. Diana, a bashful adolescent just emerging from childhood, met the criteria. Charles was already in love with someone else, although the world was unaware of this at the time. It was none other than Camilla, his former partner, the woman who would cause the greatest catastrophe in contemporary royal history and destroy many lives. Most people ignored what was disclosed during the engagement interview when Charles proposed to Diana in February 1981. Diana immediately responded, of course, when asked if they were in love. Charles paused. His famous quote, "Whatever in love means," followed. It wasn't a verbal blunder. It served as a warning, but nobody heeded it. 750 million people worldwide watched the July 1981 wedding on television. They dubbed it a fairy tale. It resembled a funeral march, though, behind the royal gates. Days before the wedding, Diana had discovered a bracelet that Charles had ordered for Camilla. He handed it to her, inscribed with the initials G and F, signifying Gladys and Fred, their pet names for one another. Diana challenged him, but the monarchy's apparatus outweighed her suffering. She was instructed to be silent and to stop talking. They remained silent during their marriage. Charles continued to communicate with Camilla while keeping it a secret from Diana and everyone else. The truth, however, always leaves a trace. Presents phone conversations and private encounters. The press started to move around. Diana herself felt confined. She acknowledged years later that she knew she was marrying 3 individuals the day she walked down the aisle. By the middle of the 1980s, the cracks were widely known. Diana's bulimia was exacerbated by loneliness, stress, and betrayal. Charles became colder and more aloof, going in Camilla's direction. Leaked recordings of their private discussions resulted in some of the most embarrassing scandals in royal history. The Camilla Gate tape, which was released in 1993, is the one that the public will never forget. In it, Charles was heard joking that he wanted to be reincarnated as Camilla's tampon and telling her that he wished he could live inside her pants. It was humiliating for the monarchy on a level they had never experienced before, but we will go into further detail about it later. For Charles, it meant that the very secret he had spent decades trying to conceal was now public knowledge. However, the extent of this was unknown to the general population. Not only were the tapes embarrassing, they disclosed that Charles, not even for his wife, had never planned to part with Camilla, not even for his nation. He put everything on the line. and questions were raised as more information came to light. Why was Charles publicly and aggressively pursuing Camilla when Diana, the world's most photographed lady, was sinking into despair? Why was Diana sacrificed by the monarchy in order to keep Charles safe? To what extent would Charles go in order to conceal the truth? The public was offered the justification that Charles and Diana were just not compatible when things were falling apart. However, neither the betrayal Diana endured nor the reason the Queen herself intervened and demanded their separation in 1992 can be explained by that word. The incompatibility was not this. Charles refused to halt the love affair that ended this marriage. This is the end of the story. Starts to lose their mind because the question still stood. What was Charles actually protecting when he maintained appearances even after all of this? His standing or anything more significant? When Charles eventually revealed what we thought after decades, it wasn't just about Camilla. It was about the cover-ups, the institution, and the agonizing price of keeping quiet. However, we must uncover every secret layer that led him to that position before we can make that confession. His past ceased to exist as shadows behind the palace walls the minute Charles inherited the throne. Instead, it became history etched into the very throne. Britain could no longer avoid what it had surreptitiously suspected for decades. His mother had attempted to portray Charles as the king of fairy tales, but he was not. He wasn't the young prince of hero either. Betrayed and plagued by the woman the world loved more than him, he was the emperor of scandal. The day Charles was crowned seemed to bring back every scandal he had experienced. There has been increasing concern about his involvement in Diana's misery ever since the funeral hush swept across Britain. Diana's well-known 1995 interview in which she acknowledged that there were 3 of us in the marriage is still remembered by everyone. Charles' public image had been more severely damaged by that sentence than by any tabloid ever could. Many people were unaware at the time, however, that Charles had already been exposed in a more heinous disgrace, which the palace made a valiant effort to conceal. Let's talk about it in more detail because it all began with Charles and Camilla. The world was shocked in 1993 when a private phone conversation between Charles and Camilla was leaked. The details were so vivid that newspapers questioned whether they could print them at all, and the press dubbed it Tampongate or Camillagate. Late at night, Charles had been captured on tape, declaring his desire to be reincarnated as Camilla's underpants in a way so personal that even devoted royalists were taken aback. It was not merely obscene imagery. It was evidence that Charles's heart and body were already somewhere else, even though Diana was making an effort to appear content, and the nation fervently hoped to believe in their idyllic union. For many Britons, this was a breach of the monarchy's own dignity in addition to being a scandal. However, the affair was more than just an affair. It was the outward sign of a much more profound reality. Long before Diana, long before duty, and far before the crown, Charles had choose Camilla. He had met her in the early 1970s and fell in love with her right away. The Queen Mother and Lord Mountbatten, however, did not agree with the palace. They believed Camilla was unfit, too seasoned, too crude, and too hazardous to the future king's expected immaculate appearance. So they steered Charles away. Furthermore, Diana wasn't simply picked as a bride when she first emerged as a young, naive, unspoiled beauty. She was selected as a representation. The ideal future queen, meticulously crafted to mend the breaks that Charles had already caused. However, Diana had to learn this fact in real life because symbols cannot live like people. She discovered Charles' cufflinks, a present from Camilla, inscribed with the initials C and C while on her honeymoon. She later remembers seeing letters and photos and secretly knew that the marriage had been ruined before it had ever started. Charles's response to Diana's question concerning Camilla was as definitive as it was icy. "I'm not going to be the only Prince of Wales without a mistress." Just that sentence revealed Charles' true identity to the world. The depth of the rivalry within the palace walls, however, is rarely discussed by the general public. Diana was seen as a disturbance within Buckingham Palace, although being loved outside. She was described as temperamental, unpredictable, and unmanageable by courtiers behind her back. However, They never acknowledged that the betrayal she experienced was a primary cause of her emotional inclinations. Being denied the partnership she had been promised while witnessing her husband show off his love for another lady, the marriage turned into a battlefield of heartache and jealousy. Bulimia struck Diana. View talked candidly about her desperation and her search for love abroad after being rejected at home. And Charles's connection with his boys was affected by all of this. Children William and Harry were ensnared in a firestorm that they did not start. Despite their love for their mother, they were descended from the man who had degraded her. Harry acknowledged in later years that the wounds were deep, that he was angry at the way his mother had been treated, and that Camilla's subsequent marriage to Charles left scars that would never fully go away. Charles yet pressed on. He worked to change the story in spite of the scandals, divorces, and Diana's untimely death in 1997. Against all obstacles, he persuaded the establishment to accept Camilla after gradually reintroducing her to the public and changing her image. He married her in 2005. Even nevertheless, one of the most important unstated facts in royal history was contained in the statement. No one would ever refer to Camilla as Queen. She would only be Queen Consort in the future. Although time has a way of rewriting memory, the palace used it to protect Diana's memory, realizing that the public would never forgive Charles if the lady he deceived, Diana, sat on the throne. Camilla was gently accepted, softened in the public eye, and anointed queen next to Charles on the day of his coronation by the time Elizabeth II died in 2022. Millions of people were hurt by the memory of Diana's tears. For Charles, it was the realization of the decision he had taken years before. Camilla came first, not the nation or the crown, and Charles finally acknowledged what had long been obvious, that Camilla had always been the one. When he was asked in interviews that were getting close to his 76th birthday what love meant to him, it was impossible to hide the rifts among Charles's family by the time he was in his 50s. His marriage's fairy tale had come crashing down in the open. Diana's death put the world in turmoil, and Camilla's shadow hung over everyone more than before. As the heir who had previously waited longer than any other in British history to take the throne, Charles was brutally tested throughout those years, something that most people are unaware of. The palace was able to regulate appearances and ceremonies, but it was unable to stop the scandals from continuing to surface. But regardless of how damaged his reputation got, Charles was never one to shirk responsibility. Instead, he focused on his charitable endeavors with the Prince's Trust, architecture, and environmentalism. He made an effort to reinvent himself as a visionary who could bring a monarchy that was in danger of going extinct up to date. However, no ribbon cutting, no tree planting, and no speech could erase the memories of what they had heard on that tape. Camilla spent years sequestered away at royal functions. She never appeared next to him in official photos, leaving by back exits and entering through side doors. The palace was concerned that a single misstep might rekindle public indignation. However, popular memory changed over time. Charles also knew how to wait. Using perseverance and the indisputable truth that she never abandoned him, he gradually restored both his and Camilla's reputations. His relationship with Camilla remained solid in contrast to his failed marriage to Diana, and in an odd way, that constancy helped to blunt the edges of controversy. He had taken the chance to publicly introduce her by the early 2000s, showing up with her at occasions and letting the cameras record their inseparability, which insiders already knew. However, the quiet surrounding Diana's passing persisted. Questions continued coming up. Why in the first place had the marriage been permitted to fall apart so completely? Before he married Diana, why hadn't Charles done more to defend her, or maybe to get his family to embrace the lady he loved? Not at all. These questions persisted even after he restored his reputation in the public eye. Charles's supporters claimed he had been treated unfairly, but the truth remained that emotional harm had been done when it was later discovered that journalist Martin Bashir had used dishonest tactics to alter Diana's well-known 1995 Panorama interview. Millions witnessed Diana's anguish and tears, triumphant tears, and what she said about being ensnared in a system that stifles originality. Charles was in the middle of it all. What happens to a man who waits for kingship for half of his life while everyone else questions if he truly deserves it? Silently, Charles carried that inquiry. In sporadic interviews years later, he acknowledged how oppressive the media attention had been and how he felt misinterpreted and falsely stated. However, the impression that he had let Diana down persisted despite his admissions. His peculiarities, odd comments on architecture, and even his tampon joke were all pardoned by the people. They were unable to completely forgive Diana for losing her happiness as a result of his pursuit of Camilla. Nevertheless, Charles had what he had always desired by the time he was 70. Following Elizabeth's death, Camilla was formally by his side, no longer shunned or ashamed, most surprisingly, recognized as queen consort. He had been told for decades that she would never be accepted by the public, but they did. By erasing the scandal and portraying their union as fated, it seemed as though the monarchy itself had changed the course of events. Even still, Charles' voice did not convey success when he started talking more openly about his background at the age of 76. It was a recognition. He acknowledged his mistakes, failures, and the suffering he had brought about. He revealed what everyone had suspected. His passion for Camilla had never faded. His marriage to Diana had never been the idyllic union it was advertised to be, and the crown itself had compelled him to make decisions that left them all traumatized. It was more of a recognition of the fact than an apology to the public. You may begin to see, after all we have told you, that Charles's story has always been enmeshed in unspoken drama. However, he could no longer remain silent after he became 76. He finally spoke the one truth that Britain had been whispering for decades in a private speech that made its way into the public domain. He acknowledged that, not completely or as the world required, his heart had never belonged to Diana. Everything changed after that admission. However, there was one last chapter that needed to be addressed before that disclosure. For many years, Charles's devotion to Camilla was a public embarrassment as well as a private matter. Secrecy had always been the foundation of the monarchy, but it was now impossible. Charles experienced public outrage following Diana's death in 1997, when the country mourned the princess. He was jeered by crowds, letters poured into newspapers, urging that he never ascend to the throne, and Camilla, the lady he had fought to defend, had to spend years hidden away because she was unable to support him. For the rest of his life, Charles was plagued by the bitterness that he had put want before responsibility. So why finally acknowledge it at the age of 76? As the institution had already been damaged by the truth. Because the taint of the past persisted despite the palace's meticulous efforts to regulate his image. He was aware that history would not recall him as a reformer, a military king, or even a subdued ruler. His rejection of Diana and his unshakable loyalty to Camilla would be the only decisions he would ever be recognized for. But there was more to his admission than that. Charles unwittingly confirmed what Diana herself had told the public in 1995 when he acknowledged that she had been sacrificed to an arrangement he never wanted. This marriage involved 3 of us. The establishment has attempted to write that assertion off as emotional hyperbole for decades. However, the king himself defended her in 2024. Her comments reverberated throughout a Britain that never ceased loving Diana, and all of a sudden, her spirit was higher than before. The confession was so terrible because of that. It was more than a failed marriage or infidelity. It had to do with treachery. Treachery of a wife, betrayal of sons, and betrayal of a nation that had placed its hopes in a fairy tale on the biggest stage. After decades of hiding it, Charles finally acknowledged what everyone had suspected when he was 76 years old. Diana was correct. The narrative then shifts back to William and Harry, the boys who marched silently behind their mother's coffin as Charles did the same. The admission meant more to them than just historical validation. It meant bearing the burden of their father's culpability. William, who will undoubtedly inherit the throne, has always maintained a reserved demeanor and has hardly spoken out about the suffering. Harry, on the other hand, ripped it apart with memoirs and interviews, claiming that the monarchy had never made amends for the suffering his mother endured. Charles's statements now gave their disagreements a callous focal point. William aimed to prevent the crown from collapsing any further. Both were confronted with the same reality after Harry demanded accountability. At last, their father had acknowledged it. However, the question still stands. Why now? Was it intentional or was it an honest moment? Perhaps in the latter years of his rule, in an effort to ensure Camilla's legitimacy, because the confession was followed by another audacious declaration. He spoke up for Camilla, referred to her as his actual partner, and demanded that the country view her as the queen consort who had supported him through all of his hardships, rather than as the antagonist in Diana's tale. Charles wanted Britain to acknowledge that it had always belonged to her. The woman who had been ridiculed in newspapers and hated for years was now sitting by his side in the opulent corridors of Buckingham Palace. Diana's shadow, however, cannot be removed. Charles's confession reverberates behind her whenever her face is shown in murals or her words reappear in documentaries. For the first time, the story can no longer be controlled by spin or denial. The marriage from the fairy tale was a lie. They repressed the truth. The monarchy will endure. William will get up. Kate is going to assume the title of queen, and history will continue to unfold. However, the story has already been altered by the truth. Charles won't be remembered for his speeches, his causes, or his coronation. He will be hailed as the monarch who at last acknowledged what the world had long known. Diana's passing condemned him, while his love for Camilla defined him. And the tragedy lies in that Charles's legacy toward the conclusion of his life in the twilight of the kingdom is confession rather than stability or sovereignty. His comments at 76 will endure beyond his lifetime, permanently tying his reign to the woman he deceived and the one he was unable to let go. We shall not forget, just as history does.